Today, I'm talking about Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. It is a 2008 Steven Spielberg movie and was the first time Harrison Ford played the role of Indiana Jones since 1989. In 1957, Indy is sprung back into action to solve the mystery of the mysterious Crystal Skull. Tom Holland's Uncharted movie comes out this week, so I thought it was the perfect opportunity to review a movie that's in the same genre as Uncharted, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, an Indiana Jones movie that, after all of these years, I have never seen. I've actually owned this Indiana Jones 4-film box set for like 6 years and never once watched Kingdom of the Crystal Skull until today. Over the years, I've heard nothing but negativity surrounding Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, whether it be Shia LaBeouf's casting, or Indy hiding in a fridge during an atomic bomb explosion, or Shia LaBeouf swinging on vines with monkeys. Heck, people even complained about the movie's final reveal of aliens. I'll dive into all of those things, give you my full thoughts on Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, but before I do that, let me persuade you to listen to my football podcast here on YouTube with my fellow friends. It's called The Green Room, a Philadelphia Eagles / football-oriented podcast, where we talk about the NFL, and in particular, the NFL draft. Right now, my friends have their QB rankings. That's our episode this week. Give it a listen, guys, especially if you love football and the NFL. Now then, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Listen, I understand the hate for this movie. It's not as good as the first 3 Indiana Jones movies, nor do I think they'll ever top that trilogy. But at the same time, this movie doesn't deserve as much hate as it's gotten over the last 14 years. Before you click that dislike button, let me explain myself. Let's begin with the movie's opening, where Indy and these Russians go into the warehouse we saw at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. For me, immediately, I loved how they finally showed us this room for the first time in 27 years. I never thought I'd see this warehouse again, and we see it here in the 4th Indy movie. The purpose of this scene is for Indy to bring the Russians to this case containing something that they want. It's magnetic, and so they use gunpowder and bullets to find the case. And this, of course, leads into an action sequence. An action sequence I had a great time watching. It's exciting, fast-paced. The set pieces differentiate. Indy does a lot in this scene. There's bullets flying everywhere. This is a terrific opening action sequence. But then we get to the Nuketown. Part of me wonders, is this where Call of Duty got the idea of that great multiplayer map? This is where things start to go downhill a little bit. I don't care that you have to suspend your disbelief as much as you do in the scene. The problem here for me is that there's no point in having the scene in the movie. Indy just randomly comes across this Nuketown, a bomb goes off, he survives, and that's it. There's no other connection to the scene. There's no reason to have this scene in the movie, really, if you think about it. But then we're introduced to Shia LaBeouf's character, who we soon find out is Indy's son. I think this is a great follow-up action sequence to the warehouse scene in the beginning, because not only is this motorcycle chase thrilling, but I also love how much humor is utilized in this sequence. First and foremost, you have that greaser fight, which I thought was so funny, the best kind of humor that this movie has to offer. Then Indy and his son crash their motorcycle in the library. It's the same school that Indiana Jones used to teach at before he was let go, and one of his former students asks him a question, and Indy's response is so funny. None of the students question Indiana Jones' presence there on a motorcycle, and he still gives the kid an answer before riding off with his son. That is the kind of humor that I love. This is why this franchise remains as one of the funniest franchises I've ever watched. I absolutely love the humor in this movie too. It's one of the funniest Indiana Jones movies. As a matter of fact, you can't go wrong with any of these movies because all 4 films are hysterical. A lot of that is credited to Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones, and in this movie, he still embodies the character despite playing him 20 years after the last movie. So maybe now you're wondering, how do I feel about Shia LaBeouf's casting as Indiana Jones' son in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull? Well, I understand why he was casted in this role. If you guys all remember, between the years 2007 and 2010, Shia LaBeouf was basically one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. The kid was almost in everything between Disturbia, the Transformers franchise, even that movie Eagle Eye. Do you guys remember that movie? It's safe to say he was a hot commodity in the late 2000s. However, I don't think he was the right casting choice as Indiana Jones' son. He just feels like a random annoying kid that so happens to go on this adventure with Indiana in the movie. But as his son, it doesn't work. I don't feel the bond between the two. The chemistry isn't there. It's not the same bond that Harrison Ford and Sean Connery shared in The Last Crusade. So do I think Shia LaBeouf is a bad actor? Absolutely not. He's a great actor and continues to prove his haters wrong to this day, but he just wasn't the right casting choice to play Indiana Jones' son. After the motorcycle chase, it's kind of a quiet next 30 minutes. Actually, out of the Indiana Jones movies, this sequence reminds me the most of the Uncharted video games because they find some clues, then they're taken hostage by the Russians. A lot of similar things we see happen in the Uncharted franchise. Not as much action takes place in this sequence, but something I genuinely appreciated while watching Kingdom of the Crystal Skull for the first time is how this movie feels like it's paying homage to Raiders of the Lost Ark while also feeling like a celebration of the entire Indiana Jones franchise. There's a plethora of Easter eggs. Marion makes her return since Raiders. There are beats of the original score featured in this movie's soundtrack, and there's this hilarious quicksand scene that sums up Indy's fear of snakes. That was one of my favorite moments in the entire movie. Let's talk about the jungle chase sequence though in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. One of the most hated sequences in this movie and possibly the most hated of the entire Indiana Jones franchise. Well, I'll tell you what. I have mixed feelings about this sequence. I love the first half, but the second half begins to go off the rails. The first half, like the previous action sequences in the movie, is fantastic. The cinematography looks great, the action is thrilling, there's a lot that goes on in this sequence, but then towards the middle of the second half of this action sequence, things don't look as good. Cate Blanchett and Shia LaBeouf have a sword fight, and it's pretty obvious nothing surrounding these characters is real. The environment is totally fake. This is followed by monkeys swinging on vines and killer red ants. You know, people hate the aliens reveal at the end of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, but what takes the cake as my least favorite scene in this movie is the second half of this action sequence. Sure, the aliens reveal was bad, didn't like it whatsoever, but I will take that any day of the week over the second half of this action sequence. It is outright ridiculous. But sure, let's just skip right to the aliens reveal. It's bizarre. It's out of nowhere. At the end of the day, though, I will still take it over that disastrous second half action sequence. I'm not going to give brownie points to the aliens, though. There was no reason for their inclusion in the final cut of this film. They were completely unnecessary. I know this franchise has dealt with supernatural elements before, but in this film, this was 10 times more bizarre than anything we saw in the first 3 movies. Not to mention how hideous the CGI looks in this sequence. My God, does it not hold up anymore in 2022. So yeah, all the bad guys die. There's this man named Ox who's supposedly friends with Indy and company. He led them on this journey. The only reason for his character in the film is to get them to where they need to go. The film then ends with Marion and Indy's wedding, which I thought was a nice icing on the cake. They were the original couple in Raiders, and for them to end up with each other, get married, makes the most sense in the world. It is the perfect ending for this franchise. Except it's not the ending, because Indiana Jones 5 is finally coming out next year with an 80-year-old Harrison Ford. Oh God. Lastly, the final thing I want to touch on in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is how Shia LaBeouf was teased as the next Indiana Jones in this final shot. He grabs the iconic hat, he's about to put it on, but Indy snags it out of his hands before he's able to do so. So they hinted at Shia LaBeouf potentially being the next Indiana Jones in a new movie maybe. I'm not sure if they actually had plans to make him his own trilogy as the character. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but it probably wouldn't have been the best idea, especially considering that fans hated him in 2008 as this character. Alright, with my full review out of the way, what are my closing thoughts on Indiana Jones Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. How do I think this movie compares to the original movies, and do I think this movie is as bad as people say? Well, obviously it's not as good as the original trilogy. It's actually not even close. But that does not mean this movie is as bad as people say it is. While I understand the hate for certain scenes, it doesn't mean the entire movie is terrible. Because there is a lot of good stuff in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, it just so happens that there are some bad things too. Elements that we did not need in this movie, things that I'm sure if they could redo, and maybe they will in Indiana Jones 5, they would. If I were to give the movie a rating, I'd put it in the 65 to 70 percentile. It's certainly not as bad as people have said over the years. I get the hate again, but Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is a movie that I think everyone should re-explore. If you have not seen the film since 2008, watch it again, maybe it'll change your mind. The main thing I take away is even if some things in your movie aren't great, it doesn't mean the entire film is bad, and that's exactly the case with Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. But of course, guys, I also want to hear your thoughts. Do you hate this movie as many others still do, or do you think it's not that bad? While not being as good as the original trilogy, it still has some fun elements. Whatever your thoughts are, let me know down below in the comment section. Next up, I will be reviewing Tom Holland's long-awaited Uncharted movie. And of course, as always, if you are new to my channel, click the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Thank you all so much for watching this video, and I hope you all have a fantastic day.